All right, it's 2 minutes after 10 now, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I don't see anyone else signing in on the web right now. So thank you everyone for attending this month's bioCADDie external webinar. This month we have a presentation from the CASRAI group. So David, if you want to start at the introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everybody. It's David Baker. I'm founder and executive director of CASRAI. And I'd like to start by asking my co-presenters to introduce themselves and their affiliations. Claire?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Austin. I'm co-chair of the Standards and Interoperability Committee at Research Data Canada, an NGO on a part-time volunteer basis.
Thank you. And Simon?
This is Simon Hodson. I'm Executive Director of CODATA. CODATA is the Committee on Data at the International Council of Science. And so we're an international organization that promotes the availability of data for research.
Thank you. And Alex?
Hi there. My name is Alex Ball. I'm a Research Data Librarian at the University of Bath in the UK, formerly also of the UK Digital Curation Centre and UCOLN. I'm involved in various different metadata projects with Dublin Core and the Research Data Alliance. While I was at the DCC, I wrote some guidance on using metrics to help measure or at least find indicators of impact of research data. And I'm chairing what the CASRAI working group on quality dataset level metrics.
Thanks, Alex. And Tom?
Hi, everyone. So I'm Tom Ingraham. So I am a publishing editor based at F1000 Research, which is the open science publishing platform which focuses on the life sciences. And I'm involved in many of our data-focused projects, including this CASRAI dataset level metrics group.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, all. Back to me, David. Elizabeth, you can go ahead with the first slide. So what we're going to go through today is a brief overview of CASRAI, its mission and its approach, especially as applies to the research data area and the two specific initiatives that we're covering in this webinar. And then I'll hand off to my colleagues to go through the shared international research data glossary and the dataset level metrics initiative. Okay, next slide. And then ahead, thanks. So CASRAI, it stands for Consortia Advancing Standards in Research Administration Information. We were founded in 2006, and we're an international nonprofit membership initiative led by research institutions and their partners. And we deal with standards, but we deal with standards in a way that many in the audience may not be familiar. We don't deal with technology standards specifically. We try to standardize at the pre-technology level where users need to agree on what will ultimately be implemented in technology solutions in our various systems. And so we apply the principles and best practices of open standards and data governance to solving those problems and within the user community. And we call our standards standard information agreements. And as I said, they're pre-technology. They need to be implemented using technology, but they're more trying to bring together users and other stakeholders to agree at the user requirements level to have clarity and harmonization before things even get implemented in technology. And so that's kind of our approach. Our mission has two prongs, fundamentally, reducing paperwork and improving information. And the two initiatives being discussed today are more on the second half of those, the improving information, less so on reducing paperwork. But the reducing paperwork part of our mission is to, next slide please. If you'll see the 6 contributing factors that sort of rule what it is that we try to pay attention to, certain things like duplication of information requirements and complexity and frequency of change and feasibility all very much affect the paperwork issue on researchers who have to supply the majority of this information for information requesters for regular administrative processes. And comparability and maturity also important in terms of the quality of information, the challenges around quality of information, and less so in terms of paperwork. But between those overlapping 6 factors, we find are at the root of most of the problems that lead to undue paperwork for the researchers and their institutions, and also overlapping to produce some of the challenges that make it harder to have good quality information throughout the entire research life cycle. And those 6 are bad enough if they're within one information requester, but as you'll know, the research process is much more about multiplicity, multiple funders, multiple institutions, multiple partners, and it turns an already bad problem into, it compounds it into a significantly worse problem. Next slide, please. So what we do is we convene key users, and we define users in a way that, information users, in a way that might be partially unfamiliar. We include both the suppliers and the consumers as both as users. They're categories of users, and you're obviously a user of information when you're consuming that information, either calling an API and getting information back and then doing something with it in your local system. But we feel that you're also a user of information if you're supplying information. If a researcher, for example, needs to interact with a data entry screen when depositing something or when filling out a CV or a grant application, we also see that as a use of information. So they're information users. It's important that they're at the table, not just the suppliers, but also not just the consumers of information, which in certain cases would be funding agencies, organizations that need information to come in order to execute an administrative process or evaluation or something. So we categorize users to include both suppliers and consumers. It's important because that way we know that we don't leave anyone away from the table. And then, as I said, we convene these groups together into annual processes to develop user agreements. And again, I stress they will be implemented in technology, whether they are APIs or on-screen pick lists and data entry screens. That's the implementation. But the agreement is not about the user screens or the API technology. It's about the user requirements. And we think it's been a gap in standardization up till now, and a gap that we're filling. And the drafts that come out of this process, be they agreements on definitions and terms, which would be contained within a glossary, much like the one that will be discussed today, but also report formats, like the very concept of a CV or a financial report or a works report or an output report. By calling them reports, we're essentially drawing boundaries around what information elements will be included and which aren't needed. They're either not needed for that process or they're extraneous for some other reason. But that level of agreeing on what information is needed is part of the standardization process at CASRAI. And we think it's important that when you do call an API, what is your mechanism for having predictability on what will come back, what will be excluded from what comes back, and what will be included. And we think that needs to happen. It's not just a technology decision. It needs to happen at the user requirements decision level, especially if suppliers and consumers are having to interact with those systems to supply and therefore do something useful with the information. And then we publish them in a web-based dictionary, which will also be discussed a bit as part of the glossary discussion. Now, we do have one slice of technology in our mission, and that is to provide a canonical XML schema so that when user-generated agreements come out of the CASRAI process, it's one thing for them to be read and understood by users, non-technology users, but there still needs to be an expression of those agreements that is something that could be consumed, understood, analyzed, and tested by technology users. And there are many different technologies available for doing that. We've chosen XML schema as the one to be as clear and unambiguous in terms of what are the contents of any particular standard information agreement. So I think that's the end of my slides. Elizabeth, yeah. So I'll just hand off to the next part of the process to talk about two specific initiatives that we think are especially important to the bioCADDIE community. And I'll hand over to Claire to take it from here.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
So I'd like to, before I get into the glossary, draw your attention to two historical events. One, the Tower of Babel, which as we know was a catastrophic failure. An attempt to make a universal language, great aspirations for wonderful things, and it ended up in failure and dispersion, confusion, and conflict. Next slide, please. The other example is Bunji, a language spoken by Métis in Manitoba in Canada, which drew upon a number of different languages, English, Scottish, Gaelic, Acadian, Cree, and Ojibwe, to find a practical way of communicating amongst these different peoples coming from different backgrounds. So they drew upon each other and found a common understanding. So keeping those two examples in mind, what the Research Data Management Glossary is not is an attempt at another Tower of Babel. Does not pretend to be an all-encompassing super mega dictionary or to replace any other of the glossaries or dictionaries that exist currently relevant to research data management. What it is a practical tool to enable teams coming from different backgrounds to communicate with each other and understand, have a common understanding of the tools that they're using or the words that they're using. So what we're seeking on the one hand is stability in a glossary, because if it's constantly changing, it won't be useful. But also agility in keeping it relevant and adding new terms as necessary or modifying terms as they become obsolete. Why did we start this glossary? Because of difficulties experienced and observed when people come together and especially use the same terms and understanding different meanings from them, which leads to miscommunication and sometimes conflict. And the purpose then is to allow really development of common understanding of terms, at least when working in these multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary groups, that we understand what we mean when we use a particular term. So the definition of success is that the glossary is used, that the terms are actually used by people, and the measure of success will be that people from diverse backgrounds agree with and use these terms and definitions, and also agree to sustain a process of iteratively evolving the glossary. Could you advance a couple of slides, please, up until development methods? Next one, yeah. So what we did was look at a wide range of glossaries from government, community, and so on. The criteria was ease of availability and relevance. We did not use automated methods for extraction, and it's important to realize that the glossary is not meant to replace machine-usable sources of terms, for example, RDF technologies. You can advance again, please, to pilot research. Once we had the glossary assembled, and I must say this is the second edition of a glossary that was initially developed, we emailed it used LinkedIn and Twitter, and reached an estimated 150,000 or so accounts. And the glossary landing page, as a result, received hits from about over 1,000 unique IP addresses. So if I just summarize then the development of the glossary and where we're at, the transdisciplinary glossary for research data management developed to facilitate communication between diverse groups concerned with the improvement of research data management. There exists presently a total of more than 500 terms and definitions. The initial compilation from a variety of online sources and specialized lexicons and consultation with domain-specific experts. Community sourcing was used to refine the glossary, and as I just said, community organizations have pushed the glossary out, and also a questionnaire that is associated with it out to over 100,000 people. The need emerged because there is a need to refer to new concepts and also to speak a common language. And I want to emphasize again that the glossary is absolutely not meant to replace other specialized glossaries, but to be a common meeting ground. I believe that somewhere in these slides there is a link to the glossary on the CASRAI website, and there you will find a SurveyMonkey where you can provide feedback, and we invite you to participate in the continuing development of the glossary on the wiki, where you can suggest new terms or modifications to the terms that exist. And on that, I think I will pass on to, is it Simon?
Yes, it is. Just unmuting myself. Thanks very much. Okay, so Simon Hodson, Executive Director of CODATA. Really just a few slides to indicate why CODATA is interested in this activity, is supportive of it, and intends also to help convene the activity. So why we think it's important and what our role is. And in doing so, I'll just say a little bit about CODATA's activity as well. So if you could advance the slide, please. So CODATA stands for the Committee on Data of the International Council of Science. We've actually been around since 1966. In that period, our mission and strategy has changed a little. When we were established, it was very much to ensure the availability of certain core data sets and reference data sets which were widely used in chemistry, physical science, in physics, thermodynamics, etc. But obviously our mission has broadened, and now our strategy is defined under three heads. We care about and advance open data policies, and we do a lot of work in the policy area. There's some of our recent reports indicated there. We've done a recent report on data policies, on the value of open data sharing for an organization called GEO. We've done lots of work in the area of data citation, contributed to the Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles, and most recently an international accord for our parent body, the International Council of Science, on open data in a big data world. We also work in the areas of frontiers of data science, so that's some of the technical issues around data standards or data analysis in particular fields. We have the Data Science Journal, and we're organizing with the Research Data Alliance and the World Data System an event called International Data Week, which will be a major conference for people that care about the role of data in research, which will be in September in Denver, Colorado. And that combines the Research Data Alliance plenary meeting and SciDataCon, which is the research conference that we organize. And we also do a lot of work in capacity building, and we're running training courses in various countries around the world in data science skills. If you could advance the slides, please. Now, CODATA's part of the International Council of Science. I think of us as an arm's length mission group to push the data agenda in the scientific and research community more broadly. And because of that origin, we have a dual membership. We have national members, which traditionally were national academies of sciences, but they're increasingly also data organizations which can represent the national perspective. And on the other axis, if you like, we also have members that are international scientific unions. And this creates a potential source of strength. It is, I think, mostly a sort of strength when we can articulate it, in that we can explore the national dimension of data issues and the dimension of data issues for particular research disciplines. And that, as well, is something that we seek to bring to bear in this sort of work, where it involves seeking agreement internationally and across disciplines about the meaning of particular terms. So that's why we think CODATA, in partnership with other organizations, is well placed to convene this sort of activity. If you could advance the slide, please. So one of the most long-standing pieces of work we do in the standardization and international agreement area is the work of the CODATA Task Force on Fundamental Physical Constants. So that's one of the most long-standing groups. They really got going in 1968. And since that year, they have been the international body which performs a form of systematic review on the empirical work done to define particular constants which are essential for physics and chemistry. And you can see that's one side of a little wallet card that we hand out. And there's a link to the article in Archive, which is there, and also some of the details in Zenodo as well with a DOI. So again, that's the sort of coordination work which CODATA convenes, drawing membership to that task group from various countries and from various bodies with an interest in that sort of research and in the standardization. We bring together that group, and every 4 years or so they perform a systematic review of the empirical research and propose or not greater degrees of accuracy or even revision of those fundamental constants. If you'd advance the slide, please. So, in a number of areas, we've done work of that sort of standardization and pre-standardization work. And again, to repeat the point, this is drawing on those links with the International Council of Science and with the international scientific unions, following the modus operandi of convening researchers representative of particular research areas, engaging with data experts, standard bodies, international organizations, convening the working group, and producing the proto-standard or statement in particular areas. Next slide, please. So one of the pieces of work that we have at the moment is the CODATA Working Group on Description of Nanomaterials. Now, how one describes the particular qualities of nanomaterials is a key issue and a key research area in nanomaterials research, and it crosses a number of disciplines. So some 3 or 4 years ago now, with benefit from a small grant from the International Council of Science, we convened a broad cross-disciplinary workshop, which led to the formation of a working group and the production of a draft framework for the description of nanomaterials. And that work is now being further refined and validated in the context of a European Commission FP7 project, one of the last FP7 projects. And that European project is taking the view of the need for research in the area of toxicity of nanomaterials. To what extent does the incredibly small size and the unusual shape of nanomaterials affect their toxicity? Now, we can't measure that effectively unless we agree upon how we describe those particular features, whether that's the shape or the size or etc. And so the uniform description system is a necessary and important contribution to that. But it's one which, again, requires the convening of people that look at nanomaterials from a variety of different perspectives. So although that's information and a detail which is a little bit to the side of what we're proposing with the the research data glossary, I think you can see that it's a similar challenge and a similar exercise of bringing together the community different perspectives in order to achieve agreement on the meaning of particular terms. Next slide, please. So why glossary for research data terms? So I've said a little bit about what CODATA can bring to this. Science is international, and there is, most evidently, it seems to me, as we get the rise in importance of data policies, the increasing awareness of the need to communicate the research data that underpins research articles, the need to integrate that practice in the workflows and the processes of researchers. There's an increasing need to understand and agree on a whole load of terms around research data, both in terms of what they actually mean and, for certain of those terms, their place in a broader taxonomy or ontology, which would be linked to certain information values. So that agreement is essential. CODATA's got a long history and a mission of providing that international coordination in the data area. And something that I'll also say is that I've worked with CASRAI in the past, and David and I have had interesting discussions about their process, and I greatly admire the way in which CASRAI goes around the process and the formula of reviewing a concept, discussing that with the working group, and seeking to establish a consensus, but it's a sort of rolling consensus that is adapted as according to the work of the working group. So I think that's something that we'd like to contribute and be part of, but also that we bring in, as I've said, the international community, and particularly the input of the International Council of Science and that membership of scientific academies and international scientific units. And I think that's my contribution to the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. You can take us back a little bit to the other slides, and I'll hand off to Alex, I think.
Hello there. So yes, if you could move on to the next slide. Yes, we've got a community of interest around dataset level metrics, and the thing that is interesting to us about this is, well, we've got this whole movement towards open data, of sharing research data, but the unfortunate aspect of this is that the people who benefit from open data tend to be the people on the receiving end. There isn't very much in it for the people doing the sharing. So getting them to share their data can be a bit of an uphill struggle. Now, research funders around the world have been applying pressure the best way they can by making funding conditional on researchers taking appropriate steps to share their data, but mandates only get you so far, because if you try and force someone to do it, the chances are they'll end up doing it grudgingly and badly. So if you want them to do it well, they must really want to do it themselves, and so they must have some kind of incentive for doing it beyond just the threat of something bad happening to them. So the interest of our group is about how to give researchers a career benefit from sharing their data. How can the impact of their data be taken into account when it comes to things like recruitment or promotion within their institutions? And the other aspect of quality is also a lot of people don't quite know how to do it properly. They because it's in some disciplines, at least, it's quite unusual to be using third-party data, stuff that people have already shared. It's not necessarily obvious to the researchers as to what they need to do to their data in order to put it into a state where it's comfortable for their peer researchers to be able to validate and reuse. So ideally what they need is some kind of feedback that can tell them the level of quality that the data they're sharing has. Now, these are quite big questions, and there are nuances to both in impact and quality that only humans really can appreciate, but there are not enough data experts in the world to be able to review and judge the impact of each and every data set. In order to make the task a bit more scalable, we do need a degree of automation to get us started, and hence there's a need and a place for metrics to be able to start this process and at least get us some way towards finding solutions. So if you can move on to the next slide now, please. So the aim of this community of interest is to define sets of metrics that can be used as a starting point for decisions about impact and quality, and as I say, about a motivator to researchers for doing the right thing. That's sharing their data first and foremost, but then documenting that data to a high enough standard that their peer researchers around the world are able to understand it, validate it, build on it in new research situations, and to answer new questions. So the kinds of use cases that we're interested in, I think that's on the next slide. There are several that we've identified as potential areas where we could work. So one of these is, for example, publishers of academic journals might be interested in displaying metrics for the data underlying an article, to say, how, for example, how often it's been downloaded, to give other readers an indication of how widely applicable this data is and the level of interest that there is in it. Similarly, a repository might be interested in giving depositors feedback about how their data are being used. And again, this could also be a good motivator if people find that the data sets that they've documented better are the ones that are being downloaded more and are gaining more attention, and it gives them an incentive to document the data to that standard again for their new data sets, and also gives them some idea about what documentation is actually working, as it were. A funder trying to evaluate the data outputs of the funded research, because researchers, funders have to show that they're delivering value for money as well as the researchers. Universities, again, wanting to highlight data outputs that have received particular attention, so that they can use that for promoting themselves in the student marketplace, and also to use the data outputs of researchers as a way of feeding into recruitment processes or promotion decisions, as already mentioned. Now, we don't expect that there's going to be a single set of metrics that will be able to solve all of these use cases. We'd rather expect that each use case will require a different set of metrics, even though there may be metrics in common between each set. And so the approach that we've taken so far is to set up a working group that will look at a highly specific use case and see what set of metrics could be defined in order to achieve the aims of that use case. So if we move on to the next slide. CASRAI isn't the only group that's interested in this area. There's been quite a lot of work being done in the area of applying metrics on the data set level by various groups in the recent years, one of which is Making Data Count, which was a joint project between California Digital Library, the Public Library of Science, and the Data One project, and that ran for a year from 2014 to 2015. One of the first things they did was have a survey of what metrics researchers are most interested in terms of indicating the possible impact of their data sets. And they found, not surprisingly, that what they were most interested in, what they trusted the most, were citations, and following that, the number of downloads of data sets from the repositories. So with that in mind, the project took a piece of software that the Public Library of Science had developed to provide article-level metrics for their articles, which was christened Legato. That already had support for counting downloads and for tracking formal citations. But in order to adapt this so that it worked as well for data sets, there were some other things they needed to do, partly because there's quite a low level of formal data citations for data sets within the published literature, and it's more often the case that data is cited informally by a statement of data availability, or a data access statement, or some mention of an identifier in an acknowledgement section. So they put in some facilities into Legato for searching for those kinds of informal citations, mentioning some links and identifiers from open access corpora like Biomed Central, Europe PubMed Central, Public Library of Science, and the API that Nature provided for their open search service. And they also adapted it so that it could look for mentions of data sets, again using things like data DOIs and other identifiers, looking for those in social media sites like Mendeley, Facebook, Twitter, and also for mentions of related data sets in the dataset metadata schema. So there's some links on the screen there if you want to read more about that project. Now, if you go on to the next slide, another area of activity was in the Research Data Alliance, which cooperated with the World Data System and a Publishing Data Bibliometrics Working Group that concluded activity recently, last month, but it's still working through producing its final set of outputs. They also ran a survey aimed not only at researchers but all stakeholder groups, and found much the same impression, that people were most interested in looking at citation counts for data sets, and failing that, the number of downloads. The group is developing a set of recommendations. They're not finalized yet, so I've just put on some extracts from the draft of the recommendation documents. And they're to try and make it easier to get these kind of metrics. They're encouraging funders to mandate both data deposit and the citation of data, so that it's easier to spot the impact of data in the literature. They want stakeholders to agree on how to use the statistics that repositories are in a good place to collect. And again, the caveat that if you rely on just one metric for anything really, then there's a danger of people gaming the system and abusing it, and of it having unintentional side effects as people try and work towards getting a high metric as opposed to achieving the end goal of a high quality output. So they're encouraging people to use multiple metrics. Now, if we move on to the next slide, there's one other area that I wanted to just mention that's worked in this area, and that's the NISO Altmetrics project. There's the Group B from that is looking at non-traditional research outputs, including datasets and identifiers. And again, the recommendation document is still in preparation, so this is just a few extracts from a recent draft. One of which was encouraging the implementation of the Force 11 data citation principles, again supporting data citation within the published literature. And one interesting idea that they had were that we should be using counter standards which are already in place for a consistent approach to measuring the downloads of academic articles from the scholarly literature. We should be using them for human-initiated downloads, but instead of ignoring the machine-initiated downloads, that we should find a new set of standards for deciding which one of those that we value and which ones we want to count, which ones we want to exclude. So finally, I'd like to move on to the next slide, which is talking about the group that I'm chairing, which is the Quality Dataset Level Metrics for Repositories Working Group. We're taking a very specific use case of a generalist data repository, something that a university might set up. We also have a representative on there from Figshare. And we're looking at the use case that this repository wants to apply a set of metrics to deposited data set to determine whether or not it meets a given level of quality, which they can use both in terms of their own ingest processes of and quality control, but then that means they can also communicate that on to other stakeholders, aggregation services or research funders, to give an idea of the level of quality of the data that's held within the repository. So far, we've had 2 telcons on this, and we held a workshop at the end of last year at the closing symposium of a European project called Biomed Bridges. And we're looking this year to relaunch the activity and have a 3-month sprint in order to try and develop a defined set of metrics for this use case. So as I say, we're quite at the beginning of this process, but on the next slide, which is the final one that I'm going to talk about, just got a set of questions that came out of the discussion as the basis of being able to develop a set of metrics, the kinds of things that we're interested in looking at, seeing if we can formalize it. So we've got a whole list of them there. Does the submission have internal integrity? Are all the files there? Are they all labeled properly? Is the data that's submitted what it should be, what the researchers claim it to be? Was it collected according to an accepted methodology? Is it reproducible in the sense that somebody could take the raw data, follow through the same processing steps that the researchers used, and come up with the same set of results that they've published in their paper? What kind of formats does it use? Are they amenable to use by third parties? Has it been properly structured and labeled? Does it include discipline-associated metadata, ones that are standard within the discipline, easily recognized, easily used? Has it been documented sufficiently for somebody else to be able to reuse it in future research? Has it been given an appropriate license which clears up any confusion as to whether future researchers will be able to use it or combine it with different data? Have appropriate access restrictions been applied? So, there are some data sets which, because they have a sensitive nature, can't be shared openly. But it's more about whether the researcher has thought about this at the time of deposit and has an appropriate approach to data access. Has it already passed an expert review? Because we're in the context of a generalist data repository, it's unlikely that there will be a specialist there who'll be able to pick up on any discipline-specific issues. So this could be if that quality assurance step is already taken elsewhere, then it would be nice to be able to take that into account. And the final thing is, yes, does it compare favorably with other known good data sets? If we can have a, maybe we could look at the data that's already been published, what we consider to be good and high quality, and to see how the data set compares with that. So as you see, it's quite rough and ready at the moment. It does need to be refined, and we are looking for people to help us to do that. So if you look on the next slide, we've got the URL where you can get involved, and hopefully it'll be great to have some extra eyes and some extra ideas to be able to continue this work. So that's everything I wanted to say. I don't know if there's anything Tom wanted to add.
No, I think we're approaching the end of our slot anyway. But just the very last link. So I just noticed that it should be the URL should be /DLM at the end of that.
All right, I think we can go ahead and open up the floor for comments and questions. So if anyone has anything, feel free to speak up, or you can type it into the chat window and I'll read it out for our presenters. Oh, and don't forget to check if you're on mute if you're trying to ask a question.
But the DLM, .org, what's the problem? Maybe the DLM is for the dictionary.
All right, if there's no comments or questions at this time, then I think we can finish the webinar. And the recording and slides will be published on the bioCADDie website. And please, everyone, join us next month for a presentation on the Athena project, which is something happening here at UCSD in California. So thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you very much to all of our presenters today.